Okay, shall we? Shall we continue doing what we've been doing by looking at the material on Egypt, which the textbook says is, if anything, the best example of a riverine civilization of any of the examples that they're going to give us, um, because of the unique characteristics of the Nile River um, and its environment. I'll get into that in a second, right? But let's go back and see. There, there is a very sort of deep and profound level of similarity between what we have in Mesopotamia and what we have in the Nile River Valley. And what we have is a river that carries in it silt, which is to say, uh, mineral deposits that, when the rivers overflow their banks and flood the surrounding areas, um, it creates a very, very rich and often very deep topsoil that is the result of literally thousands of years of rivers flooding and depositing and leaving it there. As the sun shines down and evaporates off the water, it falls down, falls another layer in the soil, right? And for thousands and thousands of years, wild local vegetation would take advantage of it to the extent that could get in there, right? But now humans are in there removing the wild vegetation and sort of uh, cultivating the soils and putting in cultigens that will bring back um, a, a 5-time return on the investment in the land that they had gotten in relatively successful villages and then towns. But now, with the riverine environment, you get this massive surplus production, which, as we know, first of all, is going to promote population growth, and secondly, enables a group of people to sort of walk away from the fields, specialize in certain activities, right? And activities like, as we saw in Mesopotamia, the priestly class. Later on, a ruling class will begin to emerge as difficulties begin to pop up between competing city states. Um, okay, so you have that. You have, in both Mesopotamia and in Egypt, rivers full of silt, creating rich, fertile soil that can be, once you remove the wild vegetation, get in there, right? And you also have the challenge of water for irrigation, and you have to develop um, canals and channels to do this, and in both areas they will have ways of sort of getting the water that floods and holding on to it in ponds so that they can release it when it's the best time, when the plants need it most, shall we say, right? One of the differences that the book specifies is that, um, particularly as we move further north, we get to the region where the Tigris and Euphrates are really running maybe like a mile apart from each other, something like that. And when the Tigris floods out, it covers the whole landmass in the middle. So you really have almost like seeming like a very a lake of water, and it's going to cross over and enter into the Euphrates on the other side, right? And so you don't have that same expanse here, or as he mentions, in the Indus River Valley or in China. But what we have in Egypt that is really kind of special and unique to this phenomena is that the river is going to flood both sides. And so, as civilization moves up and down the river, right, population grows on both sides of the river. And gradually over time, you have a continuous mass of people from one end of the other covering all the land, but the land itself only extends out maybe a quarter of a mile from the river banks itself, right? So you get a very long stretch of fertilized land, irrigated land, fertilized with the water that brings the silt, and then irrigated in the same fashion, right? And then once it stops, on both sides, you have desert. So it's a rather stark reality. When I was working in Saudi Arabia, my wife and I went to Egypt. We were really intending on going to West Africa. I want to take my wife back to where I had been in the Peace Corps in Togo. And the only way out of Saudi Arabia we could do that would be to fly to Egypt. And out of Egypt, we took a flight to Ghana. And so I said, well, we're going to Egypt. Let's spend some time in Egypt, right? So, we spent 10 days in Egypt going to the Valley of the Kings, the pyramids, these kinds of things, seeing what there was, museums, and just walking around Cairo, which was this fascinating, almost medieval city, right? It was just bubbling with life and bazaars and, all this kind of stuff, right? Cairo is sort of like a crossroads of Europe, Asia, Africa, right there. It's an extraordinary place. So we actually took a train um, down the Nile, but north to Alexandria, and we spent a couple of days in Alexandria. And then we came back and we jumped on a flight that was taking us to Ghana. And the airplane takes off, and gets up in the air, and you're at 30,000 feet. And what it does is it follows the Nile. So we had the Nile to our left. And so we're at 30,000 feet, and you can look down and you can see this marvelous blue strip of river running through a green, um, you know, a green area that's not much wider than the river itself on either side. And then you see the white, vast expanses of the desert lands. To our right as we're going south, to our right is the Sahara Desert, and to our left is the desert that runs out to the Red Sea and beyond, right? Into the Sinai Peninsula, but that's more in the north. And it was an extraordinary experience to see the reality of this city. Now, when we were there for 10 days, we took a train down to Thebes, one of the ancient capitals of the Egyptian dynasty at a certain point in time. And we visited the Valley of the Kings, right? This kind of a thing. But what was extraordinary for me as an anthropologist would be sitting in this train and driving through town after town after town. And you looked down the streets, and these towns that are located right next to the railroad tracks, only extend back 100 yards or something like that. And yet the streets are packed and jammed with people. And then you can sort of get a glimpse of fields beyond the houses out there, right? And you can see that even today, and Egypt is a country with millions of people, right? 10 to 5 times more people at even the highest point during the classical period, right? And so you kind of see that has maintained this, other than the fact that Cairo has become a huge, massive city that is the magnet that draws excess population from these places along the way, right? Okay, so the textbook is going to say, and I think we need to follow up on it, the textbook is going to say that, even though there are these sort of elements of deep fundamental similarity in that they are both riverine civilizations with a surplus agriculture dependent, as it were, on on uh, on the river and the river's riches and this kind of a thing. What Herodotus will call Egypt the gift of the Nile, right? There are differences, cultural differences, that perhaps can be brought back to bear with, shall we say, the differences in the material structure of both places, right? And so in Egypt, you'll have a civilization that is sort of isolated and protected environmentally even though it's this sort of jewel in the crown kind of a situation, the richest place on the planet in its prime, right? It has deserts on either side. As you go south into Africa, and the African continent rises up, right? So that the river slides down towards the Mediterranean in the north. Um, as you go there, you get to the point where there are these um, rapids that separate um, nor- southern Egypt from the Sudan and tribal groups behind, which is to say that if indeed Egypt were a continuous river that ships could pass from the deep in the heart of Africa up into the riches of Egypt, well, there would have been more raiding and chaos and things like that, or fighting between a kingdom in Sudan, these kinds of things. But no, right? That kind of blocks it off there, right? And then when you get to the northernmost reaches, you have the marshes, and then you have the Mediterranean Sea. Now, before we go any further, I would like to suggest that the marshes in the north, where the Nile River comes and breaks off into different branches, where it slows down as it's virtually melding with the Mediterranean Sea itself, those marshlands are extremely rich, and they mirror then the birthplace of civilization in the marshlands at the bottom, at the south of the Mesopotamian river complex, the Tigris and Euphrates, by which point they've come together and come out in a single way. But when they get there, they splinter out, and you have those marshes, and that forms the basis. So there is that element that's similar, but the end results are going to be different in both cases. We saw how in Sumeria we have a city state developing as the model of governance, where a single city with, shall we say, an emerging ruling elite resides and brings law and order, and extracts wealth from the masses, but who are also, if you will, gainfully employed in the farming economy that does develop around each of these cities. And then these cities are in contact then with pastoral and wandering groups up in that area that have flocks of sheep and goats and whatever else, right, they may have with them, right? Later on, they'll have camels and other kinds of things, right? As they move around and take advantage of the pasture land, the natural pasture land, they also can come into contact with the cities because there are no strict, strong geographical barriers to prevent them. So it is a zone that produces a distinctive form of governance with the city states. When we get to the Greeks, we'll see something similar but different still. Okay. And given the fact that the land is indeed open and available and groups can move from place to place, it does sort of promote a much higher level of, shall we say, exchange of goods, of ideas, you know, and it opens itself up to political conquest. We saw in 2350 Sargon of Akkad coming down from the Akkadian countryside in the north to conquer Sumeria and then all the way out to the Mediterranean Sea and creating what is the earliest form of an empire, right? When we go to Egypt, then something somewhat similar is going to happen, but it is a it develops sort of its own unique kingdom in the north, and in the north, located in contact with the Mediterranean Sea, and a king in the south. And it's probably around the year 3100 BC BCE, that a southern ruler by the name of Narma appears to have conquered the north and created the unified pharaonic monarchy, which will be the unique contribution then of Egypt then to statecraft by creating a single integrated system of government that takes charge of the entire riverine environment. And if you stand back for a second, you can say, well, okay, it may indeed make sense that it happens that way because, after all, the river is a single river system, right? And so if people um, upstream who get the river first from Africa flood their fields and reduce the water supply so much that people downstream don't get the water they need to do their, you have the potential for a real sort of internal conflict. And so you really need an overarching system of governance to sort of ensure that particularly the waterworks, the irrigation system, is run equitably and efficiently, and these kinds of things, right? Now, there is one thing that I find kind of interesting. It would appear, okay, I'll come back to that in 1 second. So it will appear in a second. The River Nile is almost clockwork like in the ways that it shifts from low water to the arrival of waters from Africa, to the extent that the priestly class, and we've already seen with the ziggurats, that idea that, if you're on the top of a ziggurat, and that's where you do your services, your offerings to the gods, right? The gods reside in the heavens. We'll see that same phenomena in Egypt as well, right? And so the priestly class, to the extent that it exists, and even in the form of shamans, are observers of the stars, of the heavens. And what they will discover in following on a yearly basis the movement of the stars and the rising and the falling of the waters of the Nile, that you can sequence the rising of the Nile by observing the movement of the stars. What that means is the priests are able to predict the onset of flooding and can announce to the people, prepare yourselves, the waters are coming. Now, they go from predicting the rise of the waters in the Nile to claiming credit for it in the figure of the Pharaoh. So the Pharaoh then becomes the source of the waters of the Nile. And it's sort of one of, well, I don't know, I suppose, if shamans had power prior to this amongst hunter gatherers, they must have had some sort of, certainly a power that comes from respect, but nothing like this. This is the first true example, at least for me, of knowledge is power, where the knowledge of the movement of the stars in the sky and the emergence of the waters then gets projected into the figure of the Pharaoh and reinforces the belief that the Pharaoh, as a sort of man god, is partially responsible for, offering sacrifices to the gods that will ensure that the Nile runs. Now, I would suggest, and some of the subsequent work that's been done, which is kind of interesting, right, which coordinates and correlates the rise and fall of different dynasties with climatic shifts that would have meant that the floods didn't come, so that there would have been drought periods um, in the South and Africa that would have prevented then the rise of the rivers, right? Now, if the pharaoh and the priestly class that surrounds the pharaoh are going to claim that the pharaoh is a necessary element in ensuring the rise, indeed, of the rivers, uh, then does he take the blame when the rivers don't rise? Now, I mean, what they did was extraordinary. Yeah, keep that in mind. It was extraordinary to be able to see the association, the correlation, the fact that one thing occurred immediately after the dog star rises in the sky, on the horizon, and then the floods are going to begin. But they had no concept at all as to just why the rivers flooded, because what was happening was the changing of the seasons there, and the snow on Mount Kilimanjaro and other places begins to pour in to the lakes and pushes the rivers and these kinds of things, right? And so they wouldn't have been able to understand why one year yes and another year no, because where they live in Egypt, there's virtually no rain at all, right? And so they cannot. They have a constant drought, other than the river itself, right? Okay, so what do we have? We have an area that is isolated off. Ultimately, it would be about the year 2000 that the so-called Sea People begin raiding in the very north. In the areas where the Greeks will later build Alexandria, right? Around that area there, and begin to push up the river, and this kind of thing. And it will lead Egypt to morph into more of an empire, as we saw with Sargon of Akkad, more of an empire, rather than sort of a kingdom controlling internally its own people, then taking armies out and conquering neighboring areas to sort of create what we would call today a buffer zone, a zone of protection against the possible invasion of enemies on the other side of the buffer zone, right? Okay, so let's see. Now, one of the things we saw that will separate Mesopotamia off from Egypt is Egypt quickly develops in their city states markets. One female writer, a prominent archaeologist, says that the markets that grew in Mesopotamia would be the kind of thing that people like ourselves would somehow feel at home with, right? Shops, like you can see today, if you go on go to the Travel Channel or whatever the hell it is, and you see people wandering through the bazaar, right? So when I was in Tehran, we'd go to the bazaar, um, usually on the weekends once a week. Just so much fun to walk around and look at all the different things, and occasionally buy something, but it was as much fun just to see the way the bazaar would act as a magnet and bring all aspects of life in that crazy city to life itself, right? Crazy, wonderful city and crazy, terrible city at the same time, right? Sort of like New York, right? Can be both wonderful and crazy at the same time. So the city states will become centers for the movement of, camel caravans and others bringing in produce to the city, right? And like I explained, the pastoralists develop an alternative economy that meshes well with the economy of the landed kinds of the farming groups in the Mesopotamian city states, because they were producing protein, in the form of animals that they could drive in and sell, or even sell animal products like like cheeses and things like that, and butters and other kinds of products that they might have made. In addition to which, the skins and the leather and stuff like that, right? In Egypt, it was very different. Egypt, you really had a monarchy and its bureaucracy very much in control of life in that regard. Most of the people who lived along the banks of the Nile River tended to be self sufficient kinds of farmers. There may have been localized little markets like I saw in my little village in West Africa, um, where women would come up and put up a stand, and they'd offer things for sale and stuff like that. And in fact, interestingly enough, where I was in West Africa, the group of interconnected towns and villages that all spoke Kotokoli, um, the days of the week were named after the sequencing of the markets through the towns, right? And so you knew if it was Bewaja, it was Pewas Day. Um, Kumandeja is the day that it's in Kumande, right? This kind of a thing. Bafiloja is the big market down at the bottom of the hill, right? Interesting how that would sort of give them a time marker for them to mark the flow of days one after another as the markets moved around from place to place. So you may have had smaller kinds of localized markets, kind of a thing. Later on, as we get into 1500 and beyond, markets begin to develop and towns become a little bit more like what we would expect, but population has also grown. Okay, and we'll look at some of the ways that the pharaoh and the pharaoh's power and wealth will put people to work for him. For example, in building pyramids, right? You can imagine what a job that must have been, right? Thousands of men working for months at a time, right? To build this massive structure that is visible from space. And it's nothing more than a tomb for a pharaoh. But of course, a pharaoh is a lot more than a man. And so, in their ideology and their ideological structure, in their system of ideas, right? Um, okay, so what was it? Let's see, where are we? Oh, yeah. So, essentially, the pharaoh and the pharaoh's court and his ministers and this kind of a thing will control trade with the outside world. Traders don't come in to Egypt. There's very, very difficult for them to get in, right? They don't come into Egypt. Egypt then, under the aegis of the Pharaoh himself, under his control and his authority, sends boats out, either boats that go down the coast to Ethiopia to make contact with Black Africa, and they bring back things, right? There were Black Africans in the court who apparently had originated in Ethiopia were brought back, but they brought back animals from, and so you have a giraffe or, a zebra or something like that, right? And it will be part of the pharaoh's entourage, right? The amazing area where he lives and what he's surrounded by and things like that. But they also sent boats to the Mediterranean, up to the coast of the Mediterranean, about where Lebanon is today. And the city of Byblos was there. And they would go there in search of wood. So Lebanon is on the coast, and you move into the interior, and as the land rises up, suddenly there's a bunch of hills that go up, and it's called the Cedars, right? And it has been famous since the time of the pharaohs, if not before, for the marvelous wood in its forest. But the pharaohs would send and bring back shiploads of wood. Because interestingly enough, when you compare the resource base in Egypt with the resource base in Mesopotamia, um, Egypt is has has much more direct access to resources like the incredible stones that they cut from the quarries, the granite quarries, and bring out these cubes of granite that weigh tons, right? Who knows how the hell they moved them, right? But they actually had to build a road that was slightly inclined from where the boat arrived, and you take them off, and then you put them. Apparently, they put them on logs and rolled them on logs, and so you had to continuously put new logs in the front, and then they had ropes and teams of like 100 men on each rope pulling these things up to get them into position. You can imagine what it was like building the pyramids, right? Without having a machine that could go like this and pick it up and put it where it belongs. No, it had to be all done by different forms of muscle power, either human muscle or animal muscle. But in either case, it's going to be incredibly difficult work for them to do, right? But it's there. They don't have to go very far to get it. Mesopotamia then had, other than the water, the sun, and the soil, Mesopotamia was really, um, what's the word? There was nothing there. Okay. Mesopotamia was an area in which, in terms of natural resources, they had to reach out to, to peoples living in the mountains for different things and stuff like that, right? And so the ziggurats, as we saw, um, are basically bricks made of the dirt itself. They've been baked. Okay, some are baked so that they resist any rain that falls, the sunlight, the winds. The bricks in the interior then are just bricks that are pressed and stuck there, right? And they constitute a wall. But then there is no interior. So there's no need for the wood that the Egyptians need to put roofs on their temples and things like that. That wood had to be shipped in from Lebanon. That was one thing that they didn't really have access to. But other things, they were much better off than Mesopotamia was. That sort of helped prime the idea that Egypt was something like an isolated unit developing its own culture without contact with other groups, and growing and developing its own unique system of ideas. And when you go back to the beginning, Egypt was a place that was kind of a magnet that drew people from all parts around it, right? And so there isn't a truly single unique Egyptian population. It's an amalgam of peoples who came out of the Sahara as the Sahara dried, up from Sudan. So you have black Africans that came up. You had peoples like North African peoples coming in, and you had others coming out of the Sinai Peninsula, right? So you had Semitic groups that were there. You had, all of those different kinds of things, right? And this fact that for the most part, it was a nation that was virtually self sustaining would help promote this isolation off from other parts of the world. And so, like I said, it's only after about the year 2000 that begins to break down, and Egypt is forced to recognize the presence, particularly coming out of Mesopotamia, of a variety of groups, the Hittites, the Assyrians, right, that will indeed threaten their hegemony and control over events in Egypt itself, right? Okay. So before we get into religion, it is interesting that The rivers both the rivers in Egypt and in Mesopotamia both ensure the survival of their people, hence are critical. And the pharaoh's claim to be the link to the gods and hence the source of the waters of life that flow with the Nile make him such a powerful belief system for the common person that it's impossible. I don't know. You know the expression "Don't bite the hand that feeds you," right? Um, you can imagine how hard it would be for um, people to rise up against the pharaoh and replace him, if you will, right? Um, it would probably lead to an insurrection on the part of the common people. But it's so rarely happened. The only time it does appear to have happened is when the Nile failed to flood, bringing with it um, hunger, starvation, anarchy, riots, breakdown in governance, right? And indeed, there are these periods every so often that lead to because a dynasty is father to son, father to son, father to son, an inheritance of the position of pharaoh, right? And so when that breaks, that dynasty ends, and you have what are called the interdynastic periods, which are periods apparently in which the Nile begins to act very much like the Tigris and Euphrates, right? Um, Erratic, not following its leads. And of course, once it starts flowing, once the Nile starts flowing again, someone is going to come forward and say, "It is I who have saved the people." And we have a new dynasty established with a new pharaoh and so on. And so it goes, right? And so the system has a great deal of stability, even though the claims by the pharaoh are obviously bogus, at least to my point of view, right? I don't know if you assume that pharaoh can do that, right? So we spoke about the unification of the North and the South under a figure called Narmer. There's something called the Narmer Palette, Narmer, and it's palette, Palettte. And if you're on a computer, put this on pause for a second, go to Google and put in Narmer's palette, and there are some marvelous pictures of it. It's an object that has been preserved. Its importance as an archaeological find is that it shows us this person, Narmer, who Egyptologists have now come to believe was a pharaoh named Menes. Um, uh, but you go to that and you look at it, and again, what makes it important is he wears both the hat and he holds the staff of the North and the South. That very sort of that piece of art, if you will, um, has the symbols behind the unification of the North and the South and the creation then of a single unified pharaonic monarchy, that will extend all the way south right into the doorway into Sudan itself. Okay, so pharaonic dynasties, okay, are obviously associated with pyramids. I mean, we've looked at monumental architecture in the ziggurats in Mesopotamia, and we saw them growing out of initial altar pieces into temples and finally into these massive structures that are built, right? Uh, with the altar on the top closest to God, right? Um, in Egypt, it seems to be a bit of an opposite process because the pyramids virtually come first in what's called the Old Dynasty, right? And even though there are structures that approximate pyramids in the areas around the pyramids that are tombs for earlier figures, the pyramids just suddenly blossom into life. And what is a pyramid? As opposed to a ziggurat which is what? is a temple of sorts, but totally different from what we understand a temple to be. There is no interior space. It is monumental in rising up and has an altar on the top. Pyramids, on the other hand, are the private resting place of the pharaohs. Now, the pharaohs may be buried with servants and other kinds of things because the belief system is pharaohs will, after death, come back to life. And so the pyramids are these massive tombs, you know, to indicate the power, the importance, the divinity, shall we say, of the pharaohs, right? All of those elements are there. Inside, then, we have on the walls hieroglyphic writings. Hieroglyphics are the early form of writing that the Egyptians will develop. Very, very different from the cuneiform in Mesopotamia. Now, the cuneiform, it would appear, arose in the process of consolidating and controlling the use of the fields and the passage of crops back and forth and who paid what and taxes, things like that, right? And so, as I said, the bean counters were responsible for it there. It will ultimately morph into a language that records the first known, shall we say, novel, the Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh. In Egypt, on the other hand, the hieroglyphics, which in Greek are what, sacred carvings. I wrote it down. I don't have it here, so I can't find it. I'm not going to look for it, right? And what's carved on the wall of the pyramids is often a record of the life and the events of the pharaoh himself, right? And so the priests, who are themselves scribes, they know how to write and read the hieroglyphic text, right? Will put there. Now, if you're an archaeologist and you break in, you're the first person into the tomb, and assuming that you don't die of the curse that's put on you for being the first person to break into the pharaoh's tomb, and you get there, and if you know hieroglyphics and you're able to read it, well, obviously, the challenges of primary sources are, trying to decipher not only what they say, but the bias, trying to understand the bias that they have built in to them. We all have biases, right? And the archaeologist who's there may have a bias as well, right? And may resist certain things, right? But as modern social sciences, including history, have advanced, we recognize that the only way to, in the Orient, they have an expression: the only way out is through. And the only way you can transcend your own personal biases is by admitting them up front, and say that, I opposed, whatever, right? I'm on the left, I'm on the right in contemporary terms, right? You indicate where you would be yourself and what you might be looking for, right? This kind of a thing. So that someone who comes and reads your writing is able to say, okay, you laid down what your bias is. This is what you found. This is how you interpret it. Now I try and go to a higher level of consciousness and see if I can understand how your bias may have influenced your interpretation. And if I go back and look at the same primary sources with a different lens, will it look different to me? Where are you? What are you? 44 minutes. Whoa. Okay, let's try and wrap this up quickly. So, Egyptian religion is sort of the outgrowth of the fact that the Nile River was settled by people who came from every different area. So each region has its own god. We saw something similar in the Sumerian city-states, where each city-state was dedicated to a god. And the religion itself is inherent in the practice of religious rituals where they would get together and make offerings and have communications with the gods, where the pharaoh was often critical. The so-called Sed festival, where he renews his vigor and the vitality of the Nile River, right? All of these things. So, if the king is responsible um, for upholding the religious cults of Egypt, it's going to be the priests who are responsible for the tasks involved, for the rituals, to make sure they follow the way that they have been, right? Of the cult itself that forms the basis of it, right? And regulating rituals according to a cosmic calendar. Like I said, they have studied the stars, right? Okay, and so the rituals then are sequenced according to the appearance of different stars as they rise, in the east. Okay, hieroglyphics, sacred carvings. There is a class of scribes, and we're going to see that in Egypt, a form of, shall we say, common or maybe popular writing will emerge. That hieroglyphics is an extremely complex system of writing, but eventually, what will emerge is what the Greeks will refer to as demotics. Demos meaning the masses, demotica means popular, belonging to the masses. So writing that was popular and belonged to the masses will emerge later on and become part of a common usage. They would write on papyrus, and we have copies of it, and the text gives you a picture of an example of it. Okay, and they began to use it for things like record keeping, but they also used it in writing letters, works of literature, and so on. Obviously, the prosperity of Egypt, and Egypt will be renowned as a breadbasket area, right? Later on, we're going to see the Romans, right, looking with lust at at Egypt, which is still, even though it has lost so much of its original um, governance, right, is still sort of this massive machine for producing food. So the prosperity of Egypt is based on the agrarian surplus, um, uh, which integrates a system of governance with the pharaoh as its head, and who will extract taxes from the masses, to pay for himself, his lifestyle, all the people who are with him. Um, at the start, though, I would just add this as a footnote. Initially, and because we're looking at virtually 2.5, almost 3,000 years of history, at the start, Egypt is different from Sumeria because it doesn't have true cities as we understand it. If anything, it's closer to some of the cities that we saw in the Americas with the Mayans and as well the Incas. So Machu Picchu is a ceremonial city that, the equinox, they had ceremonies there. People would come and then leave. Several of the major cities in the Americas were like that. They weren't our sense of cities as a huge permanent population. They were huge, but people came, spent their time there, left, and then a core of specialists, the priestly class, stayed there with them, right? Okay, so we will then move into looking at the Indus River Valley before we get into looking at China as well. Another example of riverine civilizations. Thank you.